Good morning. This is Ron. It is Thursday, August the 9th. Welcome to Story Time. And thank you very much. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States of America, because I'm the only one that makes the presumption for the status quo. Speaking to all you butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. And guess what, folks? You don't have to understand. No matter what the left tells you, you really don't. The left, you'll hear your lefties tell you that on a regular basis, especially any situation in which you are making or tempted to make a value statement or making a judgment. So if you are talking to somebody about let's say a driver, that this person was really a jerk, for instance, and the person you're talking to uh, who has been conditioned by American counterculture may very well say, well, maybe that guy was in a hurry. Well, maybe the guy was having a bad day. Well, maybe, and start making excuses for this individual and implying that you need to understand his position in this. Sometimes they come flat out and say, well, you got to understand XYZ. And you may be speaking to somebody about somebody at one of your coworkers, let's say, complaining about one of your coworkers and talking to what a bad person they are or how they frustrated or irritated you. And they'll say, well, you got to understand, they're probably in a bad mood or they're probably having trouble at home or something of that nature. And the whole purpose of this you've got to understand idea is to get you to psychologize the world around you rather than making value judgments. Because the whole point when you're complaining about somebody is that you're making a value judgment about them, either entirely as a person or usually about bits and pieces of of them and who they are and how they act, that kind of thing. So the left doesn't want any value judgments. The left pretends that reality does not exist, that knowledge, no certainty of knowledge is possible, and that therefore there are no universal rights and wrongs. So therefore you cannot make any value judgments as far as the left is concerned. So what's left in its place? Understanding, psychology, psychologizing. So by submitting everybody to psychological analysis, you remove the value judgments and from everyday life. And it's a rather clever way of going about it. Instead of coming out and telling people don't make value judgments, because people are going to go ahead and continue to make those value judgments anyhow, they go ahead and try to they use a much more slick approach. Part of the reason it's difficult to get people to do things and to change is because change very often involves creating a vacuum. If I tell you to quit smoking, the question then becomes, okay, what do I do instead? So unless I fill that vacuum for you and say, quit smoking, start eating celery, or quit smoking, start doing macrame, something of that nature, then I'm going to be leaving a vacuum for you. What are you going to fill that vacuum with? You may very well end up filling it with the very thing that you were supposed to be giving up. So you stop smoking, but you sense there's a vacuum in your life. And since nature abhors a vacuum, again, you're going to very well go right back to smoking in order to fill that vacuum. So the left knows and understands this. And instead of telling you not to make value judgments, they tell you what to do instead, which is understand. No, you need to understand. You've got to understand. But it's BS. You don't have to understand. What you need to do, particularly as a conservative, is make value judgments. This also affects our intimate relationships. There's been girlfriends that I've had where I come home and they want me to talk about how my day was. Okay, this is what my boss said. He was a real jerk. He's incompetent. He's this, that, or the other thing. And very often I will have my girlfriend end up making excuses for this boss, giving me basically the you've got to understand routine, sometimes outright telling me I've got to understand. And then when I ask her why she's taking my boss's side, she has the temerity to say, I'm not taking his side. Well, yes, you are. As a matter of fact, that's exactly what you're doing. That if I'm going to come and sit down with my girlfriend and talk to her and discuss my day, the point of it is so that she will understand, so that she will sympathize or empathize with me, and thereby bring us closer together rather than sympathizing with my boss and alienating us, putting a barrier between the two of us in terms of creating an intimate relationship. So remember, when you hear the left, and left is anybody who acts left. You act like a lefty, you're a lefty. And so anybody that's going to tell you you've got to understand or starts to make excuses, you can immediately say, tell them, especially if it's somebody close to you, a friend, excuse me, but the whole reason I'm telling you this is because I expect you to understand me, not understand the other person. Okay, so when I come back, it's going to be a little bit of Ayn Rand and her lexicon. Thank you very much. And I like the Ayn Rand, the book called the Ayn Rand Lexicon, because it's full of definitions. And one of Ayn Rand's chief complaints, valid complaints, is that the left ignores definitions. They like power, and one of the ways that you can have power is by refusing to define your terms. Then you keep everything nice and loose, and then you can change or alter the conversation however you want by simply saying, oh, I didn't say that, or I didn't mean it that way. So one of the things that you want to do with lefties is make sure that you're both talking about the same thing. You get your terms straight. It's called coming to terms. Make sure you get all the definitions straight. And if they're not defining terms, it's also an indication that they are making arbitrary statements, which you can ignore. So today's selection is art. Art is a selective recreation of reality according to an artist's metaphysical value judgments. Man's profound need of art lies in the fact that his cognitive faculty is conceptual, i.e., that he acquires knowledge by means of abstractions and needs the power to bring his widest metaphysical abstractions into his immediate perceptual awareness. Art fulfills this need by means of a selective recreation. It concretizes man's fundamental view of himself and of existence. It tells man, in effect, which aspects of his experience are to be regarded as essential, significant, important. In this sense, art teaches man how to use his consciousness. It conditions or stylizes man's consciousness by conveying to him a certain way of looking at existence. By a selective recreation, art isolates and integrates those aspects of reality which represent man's fundamental view of himself and of existence. Out of the countless number of concretes of single, disorganized, and seemingly contradictory attributes, actions, and entities, an artist isolates the things which he regards as metaphysically essential and integrates them into a single new concrete that represents an embodied abstraction. For instance, consider two statues of man, one as a Greek god, the other a deformed medieval monstrosity. Both are metaphysical estimates of man. Both are projections of the artist's view of man's nature. Both are concretized representations of the philosophy of their respective culture. Art is a concretization of metaphysics. Art brings man's concepts to the perceptual level of his consciousness and allows him to grasp them directly, as if they were percepts. This is the psycho-epistemological function of art and the reason of its importance in man's life, and the crux of the objectivist aesthetics. Is the universe intelligible to man, or unintelligible and unknowable? Can man find happiness on earth? Or is he doomed to frustration and despair? Does man have the power of choice, the power to choose his goals, and to achieve them, the power to direct the course of his life? Or is he the helpless plaything of forces beyond his control, which determines his fate? Is man, by nature, to be valued as good, or to be despised as evil? These are metaphysical questions, but the answers to them determine the kind of ethics men will accept and practice. The answers are the link between metaphysics and ethics. And although metaphysics as such is not a normative science, the answers to this category of questions assume in man's mind the function of metaphysical value judgments, since they form the foundation of all of his moral values. Consciously or subconsciously, explicitly or implicitly, man knows that he needs a comprehensive view of existence to integrate his values, to choose his goals, to plan his future, to maintain the unity and coherence of his life, and that his metaphysical value judgments are involved in every moment of his life, in his every choice, decision, and action. Metaphysics, the science that deals with the fundamental nature of reality, involves man's widest abstractions. It includes every concrete he has ever perceived. It involves such a vast sum of knowledge and such a long chain of concepts that no man can hold it all in the focus of his immediate conscious awareness. Yet he needs that sum and that awareness to guide him. He needs the power to summon them into full conscious focus. That power is given to him by art. It is not journalistic information or scientific education or moral guidance that man seeks from a work of art, although these may be involved as secondary consequences, but the fulfillment of a more profound need, a confirmation of his view of existence, a confirmation not in the sense of resolving cognitive doubts, but in the sense of permitting him to contemplate his abstractions outside his own mind in the form of existential concretes. As to the role of emotions in art and the subconscious mechanism that serves as the integrating factor both in artistic creation and in man's response to art, they involve a psychological phenomenon which we call a sense of life. A sense of life is a preconceptual equivalent of metaphysics, an emotional, subconsciously integrated appraisal of man and of existence. The emotion involved in art is not an emotion in the ordinary meaning of the term. It is experienced more as a sense or feel, but it has two characteristics pertaining to emotions. It is automatically immediate, and it has an intense, profoundly personal, yet undefined, value meaning to the individual experiencing it. The value involved is life, and the words naming the emotion are, "This is what life means to me." Since man lives by reshaping his physical background to serve his purpose, since he must first define, then create his values, a rational man needs a concretized projection of these values, an image in whose likeness he will reshape the world and himself. Art gives him that image. It gives him the experience of seeing the full, immediate, concrete reality of his distant goals. Since a rational man's ambition is unlimited, since his pursuit and achievement of values is a lifelong process, and the higher the values, the harder he struggles, he needs a moment, an hour, or some period of time in which he can experience the sense of his completed task, the sense of living in a universe where his values have been successfully achieved. It is like a moment of rest, a moment to gain fuel to move farther. Art gives him that fuel, the pleasure of contemplating the objectified reality of one's own sense of life is the pleasure of feeling what it would be like to live in one's ideal world. The importance of that experience is not in what he learns from it, but in that he experiences it. The fuel is not theoretical principle, not a didactic message, but the life-giving fact of experiencing a moment of metaphysical joy, moment of love for existence. Art is man's metaphysical mirror. What a rational man seeks to see in that mirror is a salute. What an irrational man seeks to see is a justification, even if only a justification of his depravity, as a last convulsion of his betrayed self-esteem. Between these two extremes there lies the immense continuum of men of mixed premises, whose sense of life holds unresolved, precariously balanced, or openly contradictory elements of reason and unreason, and works of art that reflect these mixtures. Since art is the product of philosophy, and mankind's philosophy is tragically mixed, most of the world's art, including some of its greatest examples, falls into this category. Art is the indispensable medium for the communication of a moral ideal. This does not mean that art is a substitute for philosophical thought. Without a conceptual theory of ethics, an artist would not be able to successfully concretize an image of the ideal. But without the assistance of art, ethics remains in the position of theoretical engineering. Art is the model builder. It is important to stress, however, that even though moral values are inextricably involved in art, they are involved only as a consequence, not as a causal determinant. The primary focus of art is metaphysical, not ethical. Art is not the handmaiden of morality. Its basic purpose is not to educate, to reform, or to advocate anything. The concretization of a moral ideal is not a textbook on how to become one. The basic purpose of art is not to teach, but to show, to hold up to a man a concretized image of his nature and his place in the universe. Any metaphysical issue will necessarily have an enormous influence on man's conduct and therefore on his ethics. And since every artwork has a theme, it will necessarily convey some conclusion, some message to its audience. But that influence and that message are only secondary consequences. Art is not the means to any didactic end. This is the difference between a work of art and a morality play or a propaganda poster. The greater a work of art, the more profoundly universal its theme. Art is not the means of literal transcription. This is the difference between a work of art and a news story or a photograph. As a recreation of reality, a work of art has to be representational. Its freedom of stylization is limited by the requirement of intelligibility. If it does not present an intelligible subject, it ceases to be art. What are the valid forms of art and why these? The proper forms of art present a selective recreation of reality in terms needed by man's cognitive faculty, which includes his entity perceiving senses, and thus assist the integration of the various elements of a conceptual consciousness. Literature deals with concepts, the visual arts with sight and touch, music with hearing. Each art fulfills the function of bringing man's concepts to the perceptual level of his consciousness and allowing him to grasp them directly, as if they were percepts. The performing arts are a means of further concretization. The different branches of art serve to unify man's consciousness and offer him a coherent view of existence. Whether that view is true or false is not an aesthetic matter. The crucially aesthetic matter is psychoepistemological, the integration of a conceptual consciousness. Art, including literature, is the barometer of a culture. It reflects the sum of a society's deepest philosophical values, not its professed notions and slogans, but its actual view of man and of existence. And a lot of those examples right there were taken from a book called The Romantic Manifesto by Ayn Rand, in which she goes into a lot of depth about what art is and giving examples of what constitutes good art and what constitutes bad art. But on that note, we come to the conclusion of another episode of Story Time. I thank you very much for joining me, and have a great day.